Hello and welcome back to Autistic After Hours. I'm your host Ashra, and today I wanted to talk about the very annoying experience of how anytime you talk about your autistic traits, your struggles, whatever, especially when you're talking to an autistic or a neurotypical person, they are so quick to kind of clap back and be like, oh, well, everyone's a little autistic, or like everyone experiences that, or I do that too. And it's so annoying. And I think a lot of times they think that they're being nice, or they think that they're like being inclusive when they say things like that, but they're not. And we're going to talk about that today. Before we get into the episode, quick reminder to follow the podcast on Instagram. It's at Autistic After Hours. I post original content on there multiple times a week, and it's a great way to keep up with my short form content. Also, be sure to follow the podcast wherever you're listening right now, whether that is on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube. It makes a huge difference when you follow. It helps me so much, so thank you. So this is something I've experienced so many times, and it happens in a lot of different contexts. For example, I could just be talking to somebody and I disclose my autism diagnosis. So often the response that that person will give me is, well, everybody's a little bit autistic, or like, aren't we all a little autistic? Or, well, I experience those things too, so you're not alone, things like that. And it is so frustrating to hear that. Another context where I often get this response is specifically when I'm talking about masking. If I ever bring up my struggles with masking, with having to moderate my tone, my facial expression, my body language, with feeling like I mimic people or like I adjust myself for the context or the person, anytime I talk about those struggles, the person I'm talking to is so quick to say like, oh, I do that too, or like, oh, I experience that too. And most of the time when I'm telling someone this in my real life, that person is not diagnosed or identifying themselves as autistic. They are not autistic, and they are just saying that the things that I'm talking about are things that everybody does. And the thing is, I think when people have responses this way, when they say things like, everyone's a little autistic, or I do that too, even when they're not autistic, I think they're trying to be nice. They're trying to be like, oh, you're not alone, or like, I do that too. They're trying to make you feel like included, or like you're not weird, I guess. But let's talk about why it's actually harmful and it doesn't come across as nice as they think it does. First of all, it is blatantly just not true that everyone's a little autistic. That is not true. You either are autistic or you are not autistic, and that is why there is a very specific diagnostic criteria. There are specific criteria that you have to meet to be diagnosed autistic. You can have autistic traits and not meet criteria. You can have autistic traits and relate to the autistic experience, but not be autistic. Because in order to be autistic, you have to meet criteria. Autism is known as a disability for a reason, and that is because autism is disabling. And people may feel disabled to various degrees. Some people may feel very disabled by their autistic traits. Some people may only feel moderately disabled by their autistic traits. You may feel very disabled by certain traits and not very disabled by other autistic traits. But regardless, there is a criteria, and not everybody is a little autistic. And so saying that really dilutes the experience of being autistic. It dilutes the significance, the disabling aspects, the struggles, and even the strengths. It dilutes all of it. It kind of makes it feel like the person is dismissing what you're saying, because in different words, they're saying, your struggles are not that unique, or your struggles are not that significant because they are things that everybody goes through, when in reality, number one, they are not things that everybody goes through, and number two, you are dismissing my experience. Now, this is not a perfect analogy, but this is sort of a way that I like to think of it or explain it. It's like if you were having a dinner party and you asked everybody, do you have any dietary restrictions? And somebody said to you, yes, I'm lactose intolerant. I can't have dairy. I can't have anything with lactose. And you responded to them by saying, everybody's a little bit lactose intolerant, so you'll be fine. Something along the lines of that. That's how it feels to me when people say, everybody's a little autistic in response to me disclosing my autism. It feels like you are dismissing the struggle, because in the lactose example, if you followed that up with, if they disclosed that they are lactose intolerant and you then said, oh, everybody's a little bit lactose intolerant, you're kind of saying like, your lactose intolerance is not that big of a deal. Everybody is a little lactose intolerant. We don't actually have to make any accommodations for you because everybody goes through this. Do you see what I mean? That is how it feels when somebody says everybody's a little autistic. Now, the next part that I wanted to talk about is masking specifically. I think a lot of times when autistic people talk about masking to non-autistic people, non-autistic, or I'm going to say autistic, that is a word for non-autistic, autistic people are so quick to say things like, oh, I do that too, I mask in that way too, I adjust myself like that too, etc. I also want to add this is probably more specifically when talking to neurotypical people, because autistic people may have other forms of neurodivergence like ADHD or personality disorders, and so they may actually mask in similar ways to autistic people. But specifically when talking to neurotypical individuals, I notice that there is this response of them wanting to reciprocate, wanting to say like, oh, I mask in that way too. I do that too. I engage in that too. I adjust myself too. Blah, 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 blah. And that isn't true. We're going to talk about why. So first of all, autistic masking is a specific thing. It refers to a combination of suppressing, hiding autistic traits, also camouflaging, trying to camouflage, hide yourself in groups or in settings so that you don't stand out as different, so that you blend in with everybody else. And also compensation, so trying to compensate for your autistic traits by acting in neuronormative ways to better blend in. Often when people say masking, they're kind of referring to all of those things. Compensation, camouflaging, assimilation, anything to try and basically hide autistic traits, blend in, and bolster your appearance to blend in as neurotypical. When we talk about masking, sometimes we are talking about things like adjusting your language for the context that you're in, adjusting the way that you moderate your tone, your body language for the context you're in, maybe dressing a certain way because it is appropriate for the setting. Are these behaviors that many people engage in regardless of whether you are autistic? Absolutely. But the difference is that we are starting from very different positions. A neurotypical person engaging in sort of tone moderation or changing their speech based on the setting that they're in, or dressing a certain way to appear more appropriate, something like dressing professionally for work, or adjusting the way you talk for work, not using curse words that you maybe would use in other settings. All of these things can be seen as a form of masking or basically moderating yourself, adjusting yourself to better fit the setting that you're in. Yes, 100%. However, that is very different from an autistic person doing those things, because a neurotypical person is starting from a position of having an intuitive understanding of these sort of dynamics. The world and the society is designed for them, whereas an autistic person may and often does not have that intuitive understanding and does not feel like the setting and the world and the society is designed for them. In fact, they often feel very excluded by societal constructs and dynamics and the way things are designed in workplaces, education, really anywhere. And so we are starting from very different places, where a neurotypical person is in a setting that feels usually like it's designed for them, like they know how to intuitively and comfortably exist in that setting. And so any sort of moderation is already going to be easier for that reason, whereas an autistic person is starting from a position of already feeling so excluded and uncomfortable in the setting because it is not designed for them. And on top of that, we're having to moderate ourselves. In addition to that, quite literally a part of the diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5 for autism is difficulty adjusting oneself to fit various contexts, difficulty adjusting behaviors to fit various contexts. And because of this, it makes masking even more difficult for autistic people. It makes these types of behaviors where you have to adjust yourself for the setting even more difficult, because that is inherently a struggle that many autistic people experience. So not only are we having to do so much work to fit in because often the setting that we're in is not designed for us, on top of that, we're having to hide our innate autistic traits. On top of that, it is compounded by the fact that this type of behavioral adjustment is inherently difficult for autistic people. So now, do you see why it is not the same thing? We are not the same. We are not doing the same thing. When an autistic person is engaging in masking, it is often extremely difficult and often very different from the type of masking adjustments or behavioral adjustments that a neurotypical person would make even in that same setting. Let's say in a workplace dynamic. Let's just break down a few examples. In a workplace, we have a neurotypical person, we have an autistic person. Maybe one behavior in common that they both have to mask is the way they dress. Maybe the neurotypical person really likes to wear comfort clothes most of the time, but at work, they have to dress professionally. Same for the autistic person. They like to wear comfort clothes most of the time, but at work, they have to dress professionally. They may be engaging in the same behavior, but why is it different? Because for the autistic person, on top of having to dress professionally, they also have to do something that is very inherently difficult for autistic people specifically, which is adjusting behavior across domains. That is in and of itself a difficult thing because of things like cognitive rigidity or because of things like breaking routine, etc. On top of that, they might have sensory issues. They might have very significant sensory issues, and so wearing those professional clothes might be extremely disabling for them. On top of that, they are having to adjust themselves for a dynamic that makes no sense to them. Whereas for the neurotypical, they may not have as much difficulty or as much questioning with adjusting themselves for the context because the context is designed for neurotypical people. Whereas for autistic people, where we are often excluded from society, not involved in how things are designed, we are often made to feel wrong, bad if we don't fit in. And so on top of everything else, we also are having to adjust ourselves in a way that is inconsistent with our beliefs, with our autonomy. It feels like we are being forced to do something, and it feels like we are acting inconsistently with what feels right for us. And I know I'm making a lot of blanket statements. Not all autistic people feel this way, and there are neurotypical people that may struggle in similar ways. I'm making a lot of blanket and generalized statements, so please understand that I am not meaning to speak for everybody. But what I'm trying to say is that for a lot of autistic people, it is really difficult to engage in something like this. Whereas for neurotypical people, it might be annoying, it might be inconvenient, but it is not difficult to the same degree. Because again, the autistic person might have to make this change, which is, again, inherently difficult for autistic people to change behaviors across various contexts. On top of that, they may have sensory issues. On top of that, they are adjusting themselves in a way that does not feel autonomous because they are often not in a situation that feels like it was designed for them or with them in mind in any way. So it feels very forced. It feels very frustrating. It feels very uncomfortable. It feels like it doesn't make sense. And it feels physically uncomfortable on top of all of that. And even more than that, it can feel disabling if you have severe sensory issues and you're having to wear something that triggers those things. That is just one example. Now picture this magnified and compounded by all of the ways that you have to adjust yourself for different settings, all of the times that you have to do it in a day. It adds up. Do you see now why it is so not the same thing? Where for a neurotypical person, again, it might be annoying, it might be inconvenient, it might be frustrating to have to make these changes. But for an autistic person, it's not just annoying, it's not just frustrating, it's not just inconvenient, it's disabling, it is exhausting, and it adds up. And that is why so many of us end up in burnout. And that is why it is so frustrating when, if we are explaining our struggles or disclosing our autism, and we are met with a neurotypical person saying to us, everyone's a little autistic, or everyone experiences that, everyone has to do those things, everybody masks like that. That is why it is so upsetting, so frustrating to hear that, because no, we are not the same. We are not doing the same thing, and your struggle is not the same as mine. I want to end this episode by saying I am not aiming to dismiss the struggles that neurotypical people may face uniquely in their own day-to-day lives, but as a whole, neurotypical people do not mask in the same way that many autistic people do and feel that they have to mask. It's just not the same thing to compare the ways that neurotypical people adjust themselves to the ways that autistic people adjust themselves for society. It's just not the same, and I hope this episode helps explain why. Of course, there's isolated circumstances where this may not hold true, but as blanket statements, as generalizations, this is how I feel, and this is meant to explain why it is so annoying and upsetting to hear people compare us, or to feel like when you're disclosing something really vulnerable and difficult for you, people say, oh, everyone does that. It is so upsetting, and it's just not true. And I hope this episode helps explain why. That is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for being here. As always, remember, autistic adults exist. We deserve awareness, support, community, and acceptance. And I'm so grateful that you're here. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.